There are houses listed for sale in Australia right now for under $80,000, some under $50,000, some under $30,000. And in a country where people are sleeping in cars in Brisbane and lining up outside rental offices in Melbourne, those houses are just sitting there, unsold, untouched. And the reason why is not what most people expect. People find these listings every single day. They screenshot them. They send them to friends with the message, "Can you believe this?" And then they do not buy. Not because they are not interested. Not because they have not noticed. But because something feels wrong that they cannot quite put into words. Today we are going through 6 specific Australian towns where this is happening right now. Real places, real prices, and the real story behind why almost nobody is purchasing. Because here is the thing that most people instinctively sense but struggle to articulate clearly. When a house is listed at $40,000 in one of the most housing-stressed countries in the developed world, the price is not an opportunity that the rest of the market somehow missed. The price is information. And today we are going to decode exactly what that information is saying, town by town, story by story. Town 1, Wittenoom, Western Australia. We have to start here because Wittenoom is not just the most extreme example on this list. It is the most extreme example of anything in Australia. Wittenoom sits in the Hamersley Range in Western Australia's Pilbara region, about 1,400 kilometres north-northeast of Perth. In the 1950s, it was the Pilbara's largest town, a company town built entirely around a single industry, the mining of blue asbestos, also known as chrysolite. During peak operations, around 20,000 people passed through Wittenoom between the 1940s and the mine's closure in 1966. When the mine closed, the workers left. The town declined through the 70s and 80s. And then the medical data arrived. The asbestos tailings from the Wittenoom mine, the waste material left behind after processing, had been used in the most casual and horrifying ways throughout the town. Spread on roads, used in gardens, covering playgrounds, laid across the local racecourse, covering the airport runway. The town itself had been built on and surrounded by one of the most dangerous carcinogenic materials in human history. And nobody had told the people living there. More than 2,000 residents, miners, and their families have died from asbestos-related diseases. The true toll continues to climb because mesothelioma, the cancer caused by asbestos exposure, has a latency period so long that new cases are still being diagnosed decades after people were last exposed. In 2007, the Western Australian government degazetted Wittenoom entirely. It removed its status as a town, removed its name from official maps and road signs, and installed permanent roadblocks at all entrances. The Wittenoom Asbestos Management Area now covers 46,840 hectares, an area the government formally describes as not suitable for any form of human occupation or land use. It has been called Australia's Chernobyl, the largest contaminated site in the Southern Hemisphere, comparable in area to roughly 1/5 of the Chernobyl exclusion zone. In 2022, the last remaining residents, who had astonishingly continued to live there despite everything, were finally removed. In 2023, the government began demolishing the remaining structures. As of 2026, the Banjima Native Tidal Aboriginal Corporation has launched a formal compensation claim in the federal court, seeking recognition of the ongoing harm to the traditional owners who cannot access their own country due to contamination that someone else caused. There are technically still privately owned land titles within the former Wittenoom area. Some were sold for effectively $1 in the period when the town was already being degazetted. The government's compensation scheme offered around $325,000 for a principal property, an acknowledgement of just how complicated property rights become when the land itself is a classified contaminated site. When people scroll past astonishingly cheap land prices associated with Wittenoom, and they do, the reason it sits unsold is not a mystery. The land is classified by the Department of Water and Environmental Regulation as a contaminated site. The area was declared by the Department of Health as unsuitable for any form of human occupation. Roads are permanently blocked. The name does not exist on government maps. You cannot move there. You cannot insure it. You cannot get a mortgage on it. You cannot legally visit it. The price tells the entire story. Town TWO, Leigh Creek, South Australia. Leigh Creek is a different kind of ghost town story. Not contamination, not ancient history. This one happened in living memory, on a specific date, after a specific announcement. Leigh Creek sits about 550 kilometres north of Adelaide in South Australia, west of the Northern Flinders Ranges. It was built to do one thing: support the Leigh Creek coal mine, which supplied coal to the Port Augusta power stations for decades and formed the backbone of South Australia's electricity generation for a generation. At its peak in 1987, Leigh Creek had a population of around 2,500 people. It had schools, a swimming pool, a supermarket, a pub, sporting facilities, everything a functioning mining town community needs to feel like home. On the 7th of October 2015, Alinta Energy confirmed that coal mining operations at Leigh Creek would cease on the 17th of November 2015. 6 weeks' notice for an entire town. When the mine closed, the people who were there for the mine left. The population dropped from around 550 in 2011 to approximately 245 by 2016. The town entered what one long-term resident described publicly at the time as being in limbo. The mine gone, the state government not yet in full control, nobody entirely sure what would happen next. And here is the thing about Leigh Creek that makes it genuinely unusual among Australian towns. It was purpose-built, and the current township was physically moved 13 kilometres in 1982 to allow the mine to expand beneath the original town site. The infrastructure is relatively modern.
The houses are not century-old weatherboard cottages.
The streets are planned and sealed. But purpose-built means something else too. Every single feature of this town, its existence, its location, its layout, its services, was designed around the operational needs of a coal mine that is now permanently closed. The nearest hospital is over 100 kilometres away. The nearest Woolworths is around 170 kilometres away in Port Augusta. There are no private employers of any meaningful scale remaining. Houses in Leigh Creek have listed under $80,000, some under $50,000. The infrastructure is not crumbling. The buildings are structurally sound. The streets are clean. But a house without an economic reason to live near it is not an asset in any meaningful sense. It is a liability with a roof. The story of Leigh Creek is a parable about what happens when a government builds an entire town for a single purpose, and that purpose ends. The town outlasted its reason. And nobody has found a new reason yet. Town 3, Queenstown, Tasmania. Queenstown occupies a genuinely unusual position on this list because it is not fully a ghost town in the way the others are. People still live there, around 1,800 of them. Services still function. The hospital is open. There is a pub, a school, community organisations. But Queenstown peaked at a population of over 5,000 in 1900, when it was Tasmania's third largest settlement. That decline from 5,000 to 1,800 across 125 years tells a story that the population figure alone does not fully capture. The Mount Lyell copper mine, established in the 1890s, made Queenstown what it was. By the early 1900s, the town had 11 smelting furnaces running simultaneously, and those furnaces consumed something extraordinary: the surrounding rainforest. Between 1896 and 1923, approximately 3 million tons of timber were cut to fuel those furnaces. The sulfur fumes from the copper smelting then killed every plant and tree that remained. The heavy West Coast rainfall, Queenstown averages around 2,400 millimeters per year, eroded the exposed topsoil completely back to bare rock. The result is one of the most visually arresting landscapes in Australia. The mountains surrounding Queenstown are bare, pink, and grey conglomerate rock carved into dramatic geometric forms by the combination of industrial activity, acid rain, and a century of erosion. First-time visitors approach through dense Tasmanian wilderness, and then the landscape suddenly and completely changes, as if someone simply turned off the green. It is genuinely extraordinary to look at. It has been described as a moonscape, a Martian landscape, one of Australia's genuine natural wonders. It is also a monument to industrial-scale ecological destruction that took less than 30 years to create and has taken over a century to even begin reversing. The Mount Lyell Company finally closed its major operations in 2014 after over a century of continuous production. The town, already in long decline, declined further. The median house price has recovered in recent years to around $180,000, and that is genuinely interesting territory compared to the other towns on this list. But below the median, properties still list well under $80,000. Queenstown is 260 kilometres from Hobart on a winding mountain road. The west coast of Tasmania is genuinely remote, not in the outback sense, but in the sense that access is difficult, and poor weather covers significant portions of the year. The job market is thin. The population is aging. The median age is 47, well above both the Tasmanian and national average. Young people leave after finishing school because the opportunities simply are not there to stay for. Queenstown is currently attempting a tourism reinvention. The West Coast Wilderness Railway runs between Queenstown and Strand through spectacular mountain scenery. Mountain bike trails have been developed on those bare, extraordinary hillsides. The Unconformity Arts Festival brings national attention to the town every 2 years. Whether tourism can sustain a town over the long term is a genuine and unresolved question. Tourism is seasonal, fragile, and employs people in lower-wage roles that do not build the kind of economic foundation that makes a community genuinely viable. The cheap properties in Queenstown are cheap for layered reasons: the remoteness, the thin job market, the aging population, the uncertainty about whether the tourism strategy can hold, and the fact that the landscape, spectacular as it is to visit, came from an environmental catastrophe that the town still lives inside. Town 4, Menzies, Western Australia. In 1900, Menzies had a population of approximately 10,000 people, 13 hotels, 2 breweries, a town hall, and a railway line running to Kalgoorlie. It was a genuine, functioning, prosperous community built entirely around one material: gold. The gold rush lasted about 10 years. By 1905, most of the miners had moved on to try their luck elsewhere. By 1910, the population was under 1,000. The town has been declining more or less continuously for over a century since. Today, Menzies sits about 130 kilometres north of Kalgoorlie on the Great Eastern Highway through the Western Australian goldfields.
The 2016 census recorded a population of 109 people, a 39% decline in just 5 years from 2011.
The median house price in Menzies sits in a range of $11,500. $11,500. Not $115,000. $11,500. This is what a century of uninterrupted population decline looks like in property price terms. The market is not undervaluing these properties. The market is precisely valuing them based on actual demand. And the demand in Menzies at any given moment is the demand from the pool of people who want to live in a 109-person community in the Western Australian goldfields, 130 kilometres from the nearest major service centre, in an area where the economic cycle is entirely dependent on the global gold price and a small number of operating mines. The population can and does spike when nearby mines open. It falls again when they close. This has been the pattern since 1905, and there is no structural reason to expect it to change. What Menzies does have is one of the most extraordinary artworks in Australia. Lake Ballard, west of the town, is a vast salt pan where British sculptor Anthony Gormley installed 51 cast-iron human figures in 2003 for the Perth International Arts Festival. The figures are spread across the salt pan against the enormous Western Australian sky, haunting, quietly powerful, and genuinely unforgettable. They remain there permanently, and people travel significant distances to see them. The town also has an intact heritage precinct. The Menzies Town Hall, with its famous clock tower, which stood without a clock for almost a century after the original was lost in a shipwreck in 1905, is remarkable. The railway station building survives. A nursing post continues to serve the community. But heritage and art do not pay wages. And Menzies in 2026 is essentially a service point for surrounding mine operations, with a population that has stabilized somewhere around 100 people and shows no evidence of structural growth. For $11,500, you can buy a house in Menzies. The question is not whether you can afford it. The question is what you are actually buying. And the honest answer is a house in a 100-person community with no independent economic driver, in a remote area of Western Australia, with no meaningful resale market to speak of. Town 5, Ravensthorpe, Western Australia. Ravensthorpe sits about 540 kilometres southeast of Perth in Western Australia's South Coast region. On first reading, it is one of the more interesting small towns in Australia, genuinely pretty, set in a green and varied agricultural and coastal landscape, with a population that actually grew between 2016 and 2021 from around 498 to 580 people. But Ravensthorpe has a property history that is worth understanding in careful detail, because it illustrates something important about buying in resource-dependent towns at any price point. In 2008, BHP opened the Ravensthorpe nickel operations, a large nickel mine outside the town that represented a major investment and brought hundreds of workers and their families to the area. The town's population jumped. Property prices jumped with it. Houses that had been modest in price were suddenly in genuine demand.
In January 2009, barely 8 months after opening, BHP announced it was closing the mine.
The global financial crisis had crashed nickel prices below the mine's cost of production. Overnight, the workers were gone. The housing demand that had driven prices up evaporated completely. The mine was subsequently reopened under different ownership. The town recovered somewhat. But the experience of 2008 to 2009 is burned permanently into the consciousness of anyone who watched Ravensthorpe property during that period. A town that was clearly on the way up with one announcement was clearly on the way down with the next, less than a year later. Today, Ravensthorpe properties sit on the market for an average of 109 days, nearly 4 months. In a functioning property market with genuine buyer competition, good properties sell in days or weeks. 109 days tells you everything about the depth of the buyer pool. It is thin. Prices have partially recovered but remain modest. And the underlying dynamic has not changed. The town's economic trajectory remains tied to the price of nickel and the operational decisions of mining companies that have no particular obligation to the communities they created demand in. This is the central problem with all resource town property. You are not just buying a house. You are taking a position on a commodity price. And commodity prices are genuinely unpredictable over the medium to long term, which is precisely the time horizon that retirement property decisions require. The buyers who understand Ravensthorpe best are the mining companies themselves. And the mining companies do not buy houses there. They build worker accommodation they can decommission the moment the economics change. Town 6, Farina, South Australia. Farina is different from every other town on this list. Because unlike the others, it was never really viable to begin with. It just did not know it yet. Farina sits about 670 kilometres north of Adelaide in the South Australian outback, on the Old Garn Railway route through the desert. The name means flower in Latin, and that tells you everything about what the people who settled there in the 1870s believed they were doing. They were wheat farmers in the outback, in one of the most rainfall, unreliable landscapes in Australia. They arrived in the early 1880s, which happened to be a run of unusually wet years. And they concluded, incorrectly, as it turned out, that this was a place where crops could grow reliably and a community could genuinely take root. At its brief peak around 1882 to 1884, when Farina served as a railhead from Port Augusta, the town had around 600 people. It had a bakery, a hotel, several blacksmiths, a church, and a school, all the features of a community that believed it had a future. Then the rain returned to its normal pattern. The crops failed. The drought arrived. The dust storms came. The railway extended north and took the economic activity with it. By the time the original Garn route was abandoned in 1980, after repeatedly flooding during the wet years, which is a deeply ironic end for a town that died of drought, Farina was already a ghost town. What remains today is a collection of crumbling stone ruins that a dedicated volunteer team has been carefully stabilizing and restoring for years. The old bakery oven has been rebuilt and operates during winter camping events that bring visitors out to experience the outback heritage firsthand. Farina is not a place where you buy a house. There is no house to buy. The ruins are heritage ruins, not habitable dwellings. The population is 0. But Farina represents something important for this conversation. It is the clearest version of the original lesson behind this entire list. The people who settled Farina were not foolish. They were intelligent, hard-working people using the best information available to them at the time, a few years of good rainfall, and drawing a logical conclusion that turned out to be wrong. The settlement was based on a misreading of what the place could genuinely sustain long-term. Every property decision anywhere on this list involves some version of that same risk. You are reading the information available to you right now and drawing a conclusion about what a place will sustain across the years ahead of you. The cheap price is the market's own reading of that same question. In Farina's case, the market's reading eventually became 0, because the place was never viable, even during the years when it looked like it was. 6 towns. 6 completely different stories, but one pattern running clearly through all of them. The price is not wrong. The market is not asleep. These listings are not secrets that smart buyers discovered and everyone else somehow overlooked. The price reflects a specific, honest, and accumulated assessment of what it is actually like to live there, to insure a property there, to get a mortgage there, to sell it when your circumstances change, and to access the services that daily life genuinely requires. Some of these towns, Queenstown most clearly, and to some extent Ravensthorpe, have a genuine case for stabilisation or even measured recovery if the right conditions come together. Queenstown's tourism infrastructure is real. The West Coast Wilderness Railway is genuinely spectacular. Its arts festival draws national attention. Whether tourism can do for Queenstown what copper once did is an open and unresolved question. But it is not an unreasonable one. Others, Leigh Creek, Menzies, Farina, have structural situations that are genuinely difficult to see resolving without a completely new economic catalyst that currently shows no sign of arriving. And Wittenoom is in a category entirely its own. Not declining, not struggling, closed, contaminated, demolished, beyond any property conversation entirely. The lesson running through all 6 of them is the same one that applies to any property decision anywhere in the country. The location is the asset. The house is just a structure sitting on top of it. When the location has no economic gravity, no jobs drawing people in, no services holding them there, no community that can sustain itself across the seasons and the years, the structure on top of it is worth almost nothing, regardless of how little you paid to acquire it. The market has been looking at these towns far longer than any of us have. And the market, in each of these cases, is right.